Welcome to the Leading Movement Health Series. I'm your host, Phil Wagner, founder and CEO of Sparta Science. One of the first individuals I thought of, and I'm really excited to have him join us today, is Stan McChrystal. And Stan's a retired four-star Army general. He was a commander of the U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan, and he's the former commander of Joint Special Operations Command, known as JSOC. And I bring that up because one of the things that, Stan's, really known for is he created and implemented a comprehensive counterterrorism organization that really changed, how the culture between agencies operate. And it'd be hard to find a bigger challenge of organizations cooperating than JSOC and the CIA, as an example. Both groups, exceptionally proficient in what they do. And leadership often requires communication across your team, across your departments. A lot of times these are successful, proficient groups, individuals. How do you get them to really sync information around a common goal? And his strategies are not just for the military. He went on and documented a lot of these with his team in a best-selling book, things like, books like Team of Teams. And now he's founded McChrystal Group in 2011, and their mission is to deliver some of these leadership solutions to businesses. And so I think everybody will get a really, solid takeaway of how some of these leadership principles can be applied to your organization. So, at this point, I'm going to stop talking and give the mic over to, General McChrystal, Stan, who is just a fantastic experience across all these different areas. And so welcome.
Thanks, Phil. I'm proud to be here.
So Stan, why is health so important to organizations? Obviously your career in the military, but even a lot of the work you do now is with corporate healthcare, in some cases, sports organizations. Why is health so important?
Yeah, let's start really practically. And of course, my background was in the military, but I think it applies everywhere. If the organization's not healthy, it doesn't really function. If you think of armies in the old days, they would bring together people who had lived on farms and whatnot. When they brought these young people together, disease would go through the force in no time. And during the Civil War, more soldiers died of disease than they did from wounds on the battlefield. And so just in a numbers, a straight operational, practical sense, it's important. During my career, we evolved a bit. During World War II and before, we had what I'd call the disposable soldier concept. And that was you get young people, you put them in tough things, and those that get injured, you get another. You just send them away and you get another. We can't do that anymore because the cost of training people to do the complex tasks that military people have to do now, you just can't replace them. So you have to keep them healthy. You have to keep them functional. So from a very operational standpoint, it's very important. Second, think about ourselves personally. I remember when I was a cadet at West Point, they took out almost every cadet's wisdom teeth. And we were, 18, 19-year-old kids, and you're kind of wondering why. They're fine. And they said, well, we studied, and I never knew if this was true. They studied that if later you got problems with your wisdom teeth, that the pain impacted judgment more than any other kind of pain. Well, whether that's true or not, I know that if I'm in pain, I'm not thinking very clearly. If I can't do physical things, then I can't get out and lead from the front. And so from the standpoint of trying to be as effective as we can, think about when you're sitting in a meeting and your back hurts. You're kind of thinking about what they're talking about, but you're really thinking, boy, I'd like to stand up, or I'd like to do whatever I do to relieve that pain. So on a very human level, being healthier just makes us more effective, gives us more options, limits or takes away things that would otherwise limit us.
And I love the stories, right? Because they're always so powerful to remember key points, right? And pain affects judgment, right? It's so clear when you think about it, because we've all had pain at some point. And that wisdom tooth story is a great example. I think so when you think about organizations and they do encounter some of these, health challenges, when it comes to communication and things like that, how are some of the ways you've helped break down some of the silos. I know you've talked about kind of the command and control, right? Which is, common, at least used to be more common in the military, but also, prevalent within healthcare and corporations, right? How do you go about kind of breaking down those silos?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, you've got to understand where healthcare or wellness fits. It's not in a separate entity. It's not over in the hospital or the clinic. It's through the organization. When I was a Ranger Battalion commander out at Fort Lewis, Washington, we had very active young people working hard, but we got sports-like injuries from fast roping and parachuting and whatnot. And I went to the hospital and I asked the medical people to give us a physical therapist to come operate in the battalion area. And they turned me down. And they said, you can't have one because you don't have the need. They went and brought some statistics and they said, Rangers don't come to the hospital for physical therapy very much. So therefore, you don't have a requirement. And I said, well, it doesn't mean I don't have a requirement. It means Rangers don't go to the hospital. And they didn't go for several reasons. One, because it was inconvenient. And two, if a Ranger was identified as being broke, they were in danger of being released from the battalion. And so rather than go take care of the injury, they would try to hide it, work through it, and whatnot. And so what we did finally, took the Surgeon General of the Army to convince him to give us a physical therapist right in our gym. And that way, when a Ranger's working out without great fanfare, without people watching them, they could walk over to the physical therapist and they could start to address the problem. And so that's my way of saying that you've got to keep the force understanding that wellness is an essential component of their readiness to do whatever it is their job is. If you stigmatize it, whether it is mental health or whether it is some limitation, a pro athlete has a bad knee, they don't want to tell owners around contract time.
Right.
So how do we try to break that down? Because what that does is it inhibits people getting the care they need, and therefore from it getting worse. And so wellness has got to be, we call it part of combat readiness, but I would say it's part of readiness for anything you do.
Yeah, and a lot of the keys as you're talking, right, is how you label things with nomenclature, right? Calling it healthcare or therapy as opposed to readiness, right, is a key piece. And I think a concept that, was really caught fire within the military of transitioning from, hurt or not to more ready, and how do we be proactive. The other thing that strikes me as you talk about silos and stigmatism is, how do we make it more convenient for people to access, being less being less in pain, more healthy, right?
Yeah, I think it's got to be more in the conversation. And if you look at very elite forces where they work out together, they do things within the peer groups, they tend to be more open because they're all going through things. And particularly in the counter-terrorist forces where the demographics are older, everybody's got a little bit more scar tissue, a lot more old injuries that they are nursing along. And so there tends to be a greater willingness to share because there's higher levels of trust. But in wider organizations where you're not as well known yet, you haven't established your reputation or your position in the organization, you're much less apt to go in and tell people, I'm really tired today. I need to not do this. And think in civilian jobs, there are times when, and I could take wellness to mental wellness and whatnot. There are times when you need to do certain things, but it's hard to tell your peers or your boss, I can't pitch today. My arm is sore, because you never want to be that person that's not ready. And that's where the wellness thing comes. I'm a great believer in getting as much data as we can, both to the individual and to the organization, so we have an understanding of where we really are, where each human being's physical capability is that particular day. Because as you know, it goes up and down.
Yeah, and I would imagine that can at least be a launching point for questions, right? If individuals aren't willing to necessarily proactively volunteer information, the data perhaps opens up a discussion.
Yeah, I think it does. And if you share the data with the right people, and I would argue sometimes, share it in the aggregates, maybe anonymized, they start to understand where they fit into things. You don't feel like you're the only person that's got a boo-boo and are having a tough time.
Right. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think that's a great way to approach things and create the idea that, individuals are not alone in what they may be feeling or suffering, because that, brings with it shame and all these types of things. I'm not being a good teammate, right? And, what's wrong with me and those types of things.
Yeah, and if you think about, you began this talking about adoption of technology. And one of the things in the counterterrorist forces is we had so much access to technology compared to the slower acquisition in the big force that we got to try all kinds of things. And in some cases, rather than trying to convince people about a piece of technology, we would throw it out to them and we'd say, play with it, use it, come back and tell me what you think. And when it wasn't forced on them, there was a different attitude towards it. They would try it, and then sometimes they'd come back as very much convinced. And other times they'd say, no, it's really not of value. So I think organizations that look to adopt new things are not either processes or technology. There's got to be an understanding of the culture of that organization, how it does things and who the influencers are. Back when I was a battalion commander, I was trying to get the organization to learn unarmed combat because I wanted every Ranger to be able to be effective even without their weapons, so we didn't have to shoot everybody that we came on into the battlefield. But I found that most of the Rangers had never done wrestling or boxing, and so they weren't comfortable with that. So we went through a big process. We brought in wrestling coaches, we brought in karate people. We sent people off to special courses, and it would never take in the unit until we finally brought the Gracie brothers, and you may be familiar with the Brazilian jiu-jitsu guys. And they came in and they taught our platoon sergeants. Now, a platoon sergeant controls about 40 Rangers. And so they are the senior non-commissioned officer in that size organization. And they are the most powerful culture carrier in the organization. So we trained the platoon sergeants across the battalion until they were truly proficient. It was not optional. We brought them all in and we did it for 2 straight weeks and made them really confident. Once they were confident, then they were good with propagating it through the wider battalion. And it went like crazy. Had they not been confident and not believers, they would have been blockers to any kind of adoption. And so it's finding out who in the organization really influences everyone else. It can be really key.
I love the term culture carrier, right? It's a great term. I mean, the term I've come across, we usually call it the locker room effect. In sports, you find the alpha, in the locker room who may not be the best player, but a lot of times the captain isn't the best player, but they have that influence, right, on the rest of the group. And can both negatively but also positively impact any sort of adoption and innovation.
Yeah, every organization has influencers, and identifying them is not always easy at the beginning. We work with a lot of companies, and we'll go in and do a bunch of work inside diagnostics, and we'll come back and say, here are the influencers we have identified. And in some cases, they go, oh, yeah, I understand Phil Wagner. Of course, he's one. And then they'll go, who is this person? And I said, well, you should be careful not to let this person leave because they're really important to you. And so go find them and figure out what makes them tick.
And I think I've seen, a mock-up example that you're talking about at your group, right? And that was the mind map, some of the mind maps you guys created about where information flows, right? And who's kind of connected. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that's kind of how you're able to visualize it for folks.
That's exactly right. There's an organization chart for every organization that you can put on the wall, but that's not how the organization functions.
Yes.
It functions informally, and you need to understand that.
Fantastic. And so as you think about, the future, right, and we chatted about it briefly before we started recording, is, a lot of, where's the future of health and organizations? Because a lot of this AI and technology is rising so quickly. And, it's very beneficial in some cases, but it really puts a larger onus and emphasis on leadership, these soft skills, communication. Kind of what do you see, moving forward for organizations?
Yeah, I think, of course, on the positive side, there are these tremendous opportunities to see what the status is of people, for them to see what their own status and what their potential is, what they could do to compare it to other things, to get the best wellness program from them, whether it's working out or it's diet or whatever. So that's all hugely important. There's a dark side as well, because we know that AI is going to be able to predict things that we can't predict now with a pretty high probability. So if AI predicts that Stan McChrystal is going to get a serious disease because I've got a certain genetic makeup or whatever, then what are we going to do as leaders? Are we going to not hire me? Are we going to quietly let me go or not promote me because we know that my mean time between failure is shorter than other people? Are we going to do that? And we say we won't, but there will be a tremendous temptation to do that. And with data, we used to do it sort of informally, coaches on teams and scouts for pro teams. But this is going to be data driven, and it's going to bring some really moral decisions up.
Yeah. So how do you see that being handled? I mean, at least at a high level, how to balance that? It's all, I'm thinking of the book, the movie Minority Report, where, we're making judgments before things actually happen. How do you balance that, data driven with organizations, or how do they do that in the future with that morality?
Yeah, I'm going to be honest. I don't know. I think there's going to be trial and error.
Yes.
And I think we're going to say one thing and we're going to explore other things, and we'll sort of stumble our way along. But the reality is, it is a reality now. And the capability is there already, and it will increase. So we can't pretend it doesn't.
Right.
And so I think we're going to have to really come to grips with, how do we deal with that ability to accurately predict many things?
Right. Yeah, it makes sense. I think I know your time's always short, so appreciate it. I always like to kind of summarize, if not just for myself but for others, some of the take-home lessons, right? And one for me, the biggest take home around health is that pain impacts judgment, right? No matter where that pain is, it will impact judgment of people in your organization. I think second one, to me, is this culture carrier. Who are these influencers within your organization? Some are obvious, but some may not be, right? So how do you become aware of those culture carriers as innovation and technology starts to rise? The third piece, which you just kind of hit on, is I think most folks would be surprised when you ask a leader a question, especially one of your stature, to hear, "I don't know." And one of the things that I learned spending time with you is you have to be convinced of the reality and the mission and the goals, but it's also helpful to say, I may not know how we're going to get there, but I know where we're going and I know the realities, and I have complete conviction on that piece, right? So it's that balance of the how may be a trial and error, but the what and the culture and the mission of the team, stays very fixed.
Yeah, I think you summarized it perfectly. I guess at the end of the day, if we think of humans sort of like machines, when machines aren't working, you can normally tell. They get too hot or they make noises, they squeak or whatever. Humans try not to. Humans will try to hide the squeak and the noise because we've been trained to. And so what we've got to do is think of our bodies as that, because when the machine breaks, you're over.
That's great. That's a good differentiator. We try to hide the squeak. Well, thank you for your time today.
Phil, my honor. Take care.